Today's case left me feeling horrified. I do want to note that the details of today's case are incredibly graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. Oki Albert Kite Jr., or Al for short, had a relatively normal childhood. Al was born and raised in North Carolina. His father was a dog trainer, but unfortunately, his mother would pass away early on in his life. Eventually, Al would go to college in North Carolina, where he majored in business administration. In 1971, Al would accept a job with an engineering service company, and he would work for this company for over 30 years. In 1976, Al would marry his high school friend, Gail Kay, and with Gail came a daughter named Julie, who would become Al's stepdaughter. And Al loved Julie dearly. Even after Gail and Al divorced in 1988, him and Julie had a close relationship. And I think that says a lot about the type of person Al was. In 1998, Al was given an opportunity that would change his life forever. Though at the time, he didn't realize just how much. Al would pursue a job opportunity that took him to Colorado. And like many people who moved to Colorado, he was incredibly excited about all the outdoor activities he was going to do. Al would move to Aurora, Colorado, and buy a 2-story townhome. And as Al was kind of looking around this new home he purchased, he realized it's quite big for one person. So he would turn his finished basement into an apartment. Al figured he could rent this basement out as an apartment, which would help supplement his income and pay the mortgage on his townhome. Eventually, Al would find a roommate and things went on as normal. Unfortunately, after a few years, that roommate did move out and Al decided that he still wanted to rent the apartment. So in May of 2004, Al put an ad in the paper looking for a roommate. And a lot of people did answer this ad. On May 18th, 2004, Al Kite would actually meet with a man known as Robert Cooper to show him the basement apartment. The two seemed to get on well enough during the initial meeting, and Robert Cooper said that he'd pay security deposit and part of the first month's rent right there. So Al Kite would give him the key to the townhome, and he had a new tenant. Of course, Al gave the new tenant some papers to fill out, a rental application. He obviously wanted to check who this person was to make sure he was safe and, see references and things like that. Robert Cooper would fill out all this information, hand it back, and they just went on. The thing is, I'm not sure that Al did a background check right away. If he had done that background check before allowing this man to move in, he would have found some jaw-dropping revelations. Every single piece of information that Robert Cooper filled out on the rental application was an absolute lie. The social security number did not belong to a Robert Cooper. It belonged to an 80-year-old woman living in Indiana. It appeared the address he gave for his former residence belonged to an elementary school in Denver, and the reference number he wrote down belonged to a retirement village. Nothing about this Robert Cooper was real. Around this time, Al would meet Linda, and the two of them would begin dating. Linda would go to Al's home one day, and when she arrived, Al's like, "Oh, you can finally meet my new tenant." And she's like, "Oh, that would be great." And the only time, basically, that the tenant was nearby, Robert Cooper, Linda actually ducked in the bathroom. She had to use the restroom, so she said, "Oh, I'll be right back, and then you can introduce me." But this man, Robert Cooper, found a reason to leave. He actually left the home without ever talking to Linda. In an interview, she'd say he did not want me to see him, but she did get a glimpse of him out of the bathroom window. Of course, now that Linda looks back on it, that behavior is pretty bizarre. But at the time, she wasn't overly concerned. It didn't seem strange or anything. She just assumed that he had to go and maybe just didn't feel like socializing. So she didn't put too much thought into it until Al was missing. On May 24th, 2004, police were called to do a welfare check on Al. It turns out Al didn't show up for work that day. And because Al was such a reliable, kind, and beloved person, people took notice right away. So his employer contacted his sister, and his sister contacted the police. Police would go to Al's townhome, and when they got there, they noticed on the first level that nothing seemed out of place or disturbed. There was no signs of violence or a struggle or anything that would set off alarm bells. But as they made their way to the basement and down the stairs, they would make a grisly discovery. In the basement, they would find Al laying face down on the floor, and he seemed to be hogtied. They soon realized that Al had been tied up, tortured, and then murdered, and he was nearly decapitated. The coroner would note that on Al's feet, they were bruised and battered. He would say that Al had been tortured for hours. A detective working the case would say, "Some of the injuries were things I'd never seen before, like a knife above the eye, into the ears, down through the shoulders, just a crazy amount of torture." He would describe the crime scene as one of the worst he's ever encountered. There was blood spatter everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was just an absolute mess in the basement. Al did have a wound on the back of his head, which indicated that he had most likely been hit behind as he was going down the basement stairs. After he was hit and knocked down the stairs, he was tied up and he was tortured for hours. They believe that after 22 stab wounds, Al would finally succumb to his injuries. At first, investigators wondered if it was a robbery, but as they continued to investigate the home, they would soon realize just how much careful planning went into this crime. The sink upstairs had been plugged and a bottle of bleach had been poured into it. And in that sink was several knives, a drinking glass, a key to the home, all things that the killer must have touched. And they were careful enough to soak them in bleach. It appeared that the killer also ate some of Al's food in his kitchen, took a shower in his master bathroom, slept in his bed, used his clothing. But even more surprising is how clean the home was. The killer wiped down the entire house to make sure that there were no fingerprints left behind. And this Robert Cooper even poured bleach down the shower drain to make sure none of his DNA was in there. Police would realize that nobody in Al's life would want to hurt him. His friends and family basically said he would give you the shirt off his back. He was such a nice, kind, and beloved person. He was funny, he was caring, he was just all of these wonderful things, and he didn't have any enemies. So they really didn't know who would want to hurt this man. But they did realize that Al's cell phone and truck had been missing. As investigators are combing the house for evidence, they find in the garbage can a rental application. The application appeared to be handwritten by this Robert Cooper. And so they're looking up all this information and they soon realize that it's all fake. It leads to basically nowhere. It has nothing to do with this man. And they soon realize that Robert Cooper is just an alias. They're diving into this investigation. They check Al's bank records and they soon realize that suspect not only drove Al's truck, but had withdrawn $1,000 from a Wells Fargo ATM. But again, this killer was absolutely prepared. He had been sure to wear a ski mask as he went to the ATM. They really could not identify this person. Investigators would pull up Al's phone records. Obviously, they wanted to see who he was in contact with, and that's how they found Robert Cooper's number. But of course, they realized that this was a burner phone. So they would realize where the suspect bought the phone, but they would then realize that the suspect waited for 30 days before they activated the phone. And he did this on purpose. He knew that the store only retained surveillance footage for 30 days. So police would have no way to see who purchased the burner phone. But they did learn that this man, Robert Cooper, only used the phone to contact potential rental properties. And when they realized this, they believed that the suspect was actually hunting for victims. With this in mind, they soon realized that Robert Cooper had approached other people. And one of these women would come forward, and she said the moment she met Robert Cooper, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The witness taught languages, I believe it was Romanian, at the local university, and she said that he had a slight Romanian accent. They would also interview Linda again because she did get a glimpse of this Robert Cooper from the bathroom window. She said he was in his late 30s or 40s. He had dark, curly hair, and he carried a cane in his right hand. An investigator known as Paul Holes would actually call in a binding expert and an intelligence analyst. And he did so he could understand the torture a bit better, so maybe he could understand the killer. So Al was hogtied, but he was hogtied in a specific way. Binding expert Lindsay Philpott would say that because of the way that Al was tied, that the killer could have been a sailor or somebody from the Coast Guard, basically somebody who's had experience, quote, wrapping something tightly. Al was actually bound around the upper arm above the elbow and twice above the knee, which seemed unusual because that's not how you hogtie somebody. It usually goes from the wrists to the ankles and they're connected. But the way that Al was tied actually exposed the bottom of his feet. And as I noted earlier, the bottom of his feet had actually been battered and bruised. Intelligence analyst Julia Quinn would say that form of torture is known as falaka, and that's common in Turkey. She would say it was a way to extract information, and also it's basically a beating to maintain compliance. Usually it's performed with a cane or a switch. And interestingly enough, in that bleach-filled sink, police would find a honing rod, which is made of steel, and it's typically used to realign the blades of knives. Julie Quinn would also note that the way Al was tied was linked to a group in Turkey called the Turkish Hezbollah. And she said that basically the way Al was tied was this organization's signature. They did this constantly, and their members were known for their torture tactics. The Turkish Hezbollah would disband in early 2000s, and apparently many of the members of this group would actually flee the area so that they weren't captured. But the killer would make one mistake. There was a single blood droplet on the basement stairs that linked to another man. It wasn't Al's. Of course, this is a vicious crime, and if he's stabbing somebody 22 times, it is likely that he would have cut himself. They did test it for ancestral information, and it linked the suspect's lineage to potentially the Balkan area. So based on basically the blood test results, the torture, the possible Romanian accent, the detective speculated that Robert Cooper had been part of this Turkish organization. He said that basically he helped torture people, he immigrated to the US to flee his country, and he said, quote, when he moves away from the Turkish Hezbollah, he's now not getting that gratification of torturing somebody, and now he becomes that predator. Al just happened to be the person that he chose. Again, it's only a working theory. Of course, they took that DNA sample and uploaded it to the national database, but there were no hits. And they actually took that blood sampling and uploaded it to a genealogy system to see if they could track down family members in hopes of figuring out who this person is. So this crime is horrific from beginning to end, and this person tortured a man who just was a lovely person, who just had everything going for him and was such a kind and lovely person in general. People loved Al, and his life was taken from him for no reason. He was just such a nice person, and it's just so frustrating that this killer hasn't been caught yet. There is a description of the killer. He's described as in his 40s or 50s, maybe a little younger, 170 to 180 pounds, maybe 5'10". He had dark, wavy hair, dark or hazel eyes, and he also has a European accent, so again, he could be from the Balkan region. The killer was described as being well-dressed, wearing like suit jackets and things like that. Everything about him apparently screams professional. But a witness did note that once she was talking to this man, he seemed to be looking through her, and something about him left her with chills. I'm very hopeful that as they're building the family tree, they can find out who this person is, because they deserve to pay for what they did to Al. I also want to say that it's so important when you're going to rent a place, or if you're renting out your house or any of those things, to be incredibly careful about the type of person you're meeting. Make sure you're meeting them, and you have other people around. Make sure you're doing these background checks. Make sure you're taking every step to protect yourself. I'm not sure who this Robert Cooper is. I'm not sure if they belong to this Turkish group or if they just have a deep knowledge of it based on some research and it's a red herring and it's just something that they became fixated on and decided to do. But I will say that this crime was very much planned, and it was carefully planned. It seemed like the killer was cool, calm, collected. They made sure DNA evidence was destroyed. Everything they did just screams that perhaps they had done it before, or maybe this was the first victim. I'm not sure. But I do feel that if this person is still out there and still alive, Al will not be their last victim. So I would love to know your guys' theories on this case, so pop them in the comments below. That's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts to never miss video upload. If you'd like me to cover a specific case, as always, pop it in the comments and I'll be sure to get to it. While you wait for my next upload, check out some other videos on the channel, and I'll see you next time.